Nuclear, I mean, you guys just had a really fantastic episode with Isaiah Taylor about this. So I encourage everybody, if you're listening to me and you haven't listened to that, go listen to that because he does a great job of explaining some of it. But it's clean and you get a ton of power out of it for very little material, right? So pellet of uranium can power an American life cradle to grave. One of those is about the size of a gummy bear.
Nice.
Right? It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And it could help us meet all of our like climate change goals just by creating clean energy. I'm not a climate hawk. I'm a grid hawk, right? Like I've written articles for Compact, like defending coal, you know? But I do think that it is important for local communities to have like breathable, clean air. Like I think that is more important because like solving global problems is really hard. Nuclear can also solve a lot of like local, national problems. And that's important because if we want to like reshore anything or we want to have these reindustrialized sectors of our country, then they're going to need a lot of cheap, clean power to do what they want to do.
I talked about this a little bit with Isaiah, but I'd be curious to go deeper on it. What are some of the, maybe it's opinions that politicians have, maybe it's local officials, voting citizens. Mm-hmm. Why have we seen a decline in nuclear plants being built, used? Why are they shutting down?
So there are a few sort of colliding reasons for that in the post-war era, leading up into the 70s. And one of the reasons for it is simply that the electricity sector stops growing demand, right? So for 3 decades in a row, the utility industry was financing plants by saying, we're going to charge this to your rate base, like you, the customer, will pay for it. But there's going to be so much more power and so much more cheaply that you won't really feel it. And so they would commission these big power plants to satisfy demand. That was the business case for big power plants. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was anxiety about how much oil we were going to have, like how much coal could we have. Creating nuclear power might be a way out of some of these fears, right? So there was a big push for that. But then once you get to the 70s, like that demand growth just plummets to like 1%. It's crazy. So like you have this whole legacy from the early 1900s to like the 70s. That's like the premise for utilities. I found this quote of this one utility manager who said, being a load calculator was the easiest job in the world. All you needed was a straight edge. You just angle it upward, and be like, there it'll be, and so that stops. So the business case starts to fall apart, right? Like customers get mad when they're like, why are you building this big ass thing? Mm-hmm. And we don't need it. On top of that, you have hugely aggressive shifts in regulation. And that shifts begins in the sort of final years of the Atomic Energy Commission. They adopt what's called the linear no threshold model of like radiation exposure, which basically means any exposure to radiation could potentially be lethal, which, I mean,
it's just not true.
It's just not true, right? It's basically like pretend that your body never heals. Now it's dangerous, right? So that's like the premise there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there are political reasons why that gets adopted. I'm not going to get into that right now because that's like this whole other like side plot. That's a side quest, but it turns into this thing called ALERA, or as low as reasonably achievable. That's what the AEC rolls out. Now, if you're saying we want radiation as low as reasonably achievable, how would you design something to someone else's idea of what's reasonable when it has to be a specific criterion? Because you have to execute, you're an engineer, you have to design it. It has to hit a certain threshold.
You go do something else.
Right. You go do something, or you start to see plants getting torn apart and revised mid-construction, which does happen. So over the 60s into the 70s, labor costs at nuclear plants go up something like 137%. I mean, that's wild. In 1978, new requirements to nuclear were added at a rate of 1.5 new regulations per working day.
Wow.
I mean, who could make any money like in that environment? Who could handle all of that? So there's that. There is the dawn of the environmental movement, which is incredibly hostile to nuclear because it sees it, and not for no reason, as part and parcel of the basically military industrial complex, the man, basically the administrative state. Like that's what it's seeing when it sees nuclear. And it relates it to the bomb because a lot of people matriculate from the anti-war movement into the environmental movement, you know, and it doesn't help that like utilities were largely run by sort of like cagey, secretive, hostile engineers who were just like, shut up and let us handle it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, no American likes being told that. They're like, hey, don't step on my blue suede shoes. Right. Like that's so they're sort of grinding against, I think, certain instincts that we have towards like liberty, decentralization, and transparency.
So it's not as much about the nuclear waste per se as it is about the
the waste is the best part. It's like the most managed waste in the world.
Yeah.
No industry handles its waste the way
Isn't
the
most of
nuclear
ours
does.
on like a 1 mile plot of land in New Mexico or something?
So you can fit all of the civilian nuclear waste that has ever existed in America on top of itself and put it in a football field. So that's like since the 50s.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. You know, O&G, they store their waste in the air. Right? Like that's
What's O&G?
So oil and gas.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. Like that's what happens there. And I got a lot of love for O&G, right? Like I love those guys. But that's the reality there. You know, the waste is contained in nuclear. So then sort of the third thing that sort of makes it non-viable, not third, what number are we on now? It doesn't really matter. Is that the markets don't incentivize anybody to build it. Also, like a lot of utilities went bankrupt trying to finance nuclear plants in the 60s and 70s. And so they're all skittish. Like utilities aren't like cutting edge, we'll try this out. They're like deeply conservative and freaked out, you know? And that's why everybody's pivoting towards small modular reactors right now, because they're like, maybe we can shrink nuclear to the point where like we can deliver it on time and on budget, and it can play well in the markets because it's not this big base load commitment.
What do the technological innovations happening in the nuclear industry change in terms of this fundamental calculus? You mentioned the small modular reactors. Yeah. Play that out for me.
Yeah. So I have no idea is like the real answer to that. And anybody who says they do have an idea is like selling you their book, you know, like, and that's good for them.
Did Isaiah sell you his book?
You know,
no, he's not written a book yet.
No, as in like,
you
know, conceptually.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. And hey, I love his idea of like, you know, enabling offshore oil and gas production through the use of nuclear technology. My buddy Mark Heineman at Franklin Mountain Energy, you know, a fracking firm in Colorado, is working on that type of thing for fire to fission. Like, love that dude. So I love all that. I want everyone to win because that would be great, right? Like that is the world I want for nuclear. Everyone wins. But I don't know how many of these designs are vaporware or the real deal. And some of that won't even depend on the design. It'll be about who can put together the better supply chain. You know, who can execute that. And as far as the technological differences, like, I mean, yeah, sure. Like a reactor on paper will always be better than something that exists in the real world because it's like totally theoretical. And I'm not knocking anybody working on advanced SMRs right now. I'm just saying it's too early to tell, right? Like I'm a doubting Thomas. Like until my hand is halfway through that wound in Christ's side, I'm not going to believe I'm looking at him. You know, like that's how I am with SMRs. I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, then I guess what's the, one simple trick or dramatic generation long policy shifts that need to happen to make a more conventional nuclear reactor a much more significant part of America's baseload power? Yeah.
So I think we really need to curtail and get rid of some of these production tax credits. I mean, now they've expanded. One thing that the Inflation Reduction Act did do is that it folded nuclear into those energy credit systems. So now they're clean energy credits, right? So the markets aren't going to kill nuclear in the same way that they used to. But that being said, it's not clear how those are going to get doled out. And also, I just don't think the taxpayer should have to foot the bill in perpetuity for this stuff. I still don't like that. That's not a viable model to me. So we need to fix the markets. In order to do that, we need to restructure the NRC's radiation exposure things. We just need to put them at like a hard dose limit, It's like, this is what we think is dangerous. Don't do this. And then have everybody build to that spec. One of my like ideas I pull from Jack Devaney over at ThorCon, he has this great idea of the proto park, where we take the Hanford site in Washington and turn it into a place where nuclear reactor designers can make prototypes of their plants. Like the federal government already has the security there. There's already hookup to the grid there. We already have waste management there. So we could actually start building engineering discipline and experience doing all of these things. And then we might say, we're going to offer you preferred financing through our loan office as the federal government for anybody that has successful tests there. And only if you're going to build 5 or more reactors, because nuclear benefits as a complex engineering project more from repetition than it does from innovation, right? So you need to get really good at building it to drive the cost down. Okay. Then here's sort of like my real pie in the sky thing, as if like the protopark isn't enough, is I think we need an Atoms for Peace 2.0, right? So we need to have non-proliferation agreements that also give developing countries civilian nuclear technology, because otherwise they're just going to build coal plants. Or Russia and China, who are eating our lunch internationally, like Russia has the most international builds of anybody. They're killing it, right? They're just going to come in and build there anyway. So it's like, do we want to be a part of the solution here, or do we want to be defensive, right? And to do that, I think we would need sort of one big and one small reactor type that we can offer countries, because not every country needs like a huge honking AP1000 like we have at
Swaziland does not need
it. Doesn't need that, but Poland does, and they want it from Westinghouse. So I think we should formalize that. We should see who's like the best winner of the SMRs, and then take the Westinghouse AP1K and, you know, the most successful SMR build, and start selling them to different countries and being like, this is the deal with nuclear weapons. And then let's help you replace those coal plants, or instead of building coal plants, build some nuclear. Because I think a wealthier world is ultimately going to be a safer one. And most of the emissions growth that we're seeing now is coming from countries that want a Western standard of living, and good for them. Of course they do. If I was living there, I would be a nationalist who wants that for my country. I don't think that's that hard to understand. So we need to figure out how to get in that game, because right now we're losing. And I don't think there's any single reason that we should.
Who in the world is getting energy policy right?
Well, it's definitely not Europe, right? Like Europe is like a preview to the horror movie that could become us. So we don't want to do whatever they're doing. To me, getting it right, I mean, I don't want to sing the Chinese economy's praises because it's not a system I'd like to live in, but they're not screwing around when it comes to energy. Like they know what they're doing, you know?
And what does that look like in implementation?
Right.
Them?
So out of the 50 something nuclear reactors being built in the world, China's building 23 of them.
Okay.
Right. They say they're going to cut back on building coal plants, but that is probably unlikely if they're going to stay as power hungry. I mean, predictions are fragile. You never know either way. But the dirty secret, one of the many dirty secrets about how energy works in China, is that their renewables don't decarbonize even in the light way that ours do, because of the way their high voltage transmission lines are sited, where they're sited, and how all that works. It tends to incentivize greater investment in coal to balance load.
Because they don't have the same natural gas supplies that we do.
Yeah, they don't have the same natural gas supplies. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are doing...
So for them, it's like coal, solar, nuclear, that's it. They don't have the LNG.
Yeah, I mean, they have some pipelines, right? It's not like they have nothing, but it is not like a substantial portion of their grid in the way it is ours, you know? It's just, and they don't have the environmental regulations, so they can be like, yeah, we'll just build a coal plant. What are you joking? What are you, silly, my guy? Send it.
Yeah.
You know?